Hello and welcome to episode 97 of the Synergen Leadership Podcast. For those of you who are listening for the very first time, my name is Julian and I'm the CEO and the co-founder of Synergen Group. I'm passionate about all things leadership and management, so passionate in fact that I decided to start a podcast about it. And here we are closing in on the end of season 2, and my purpose for the podcast continues to be the same, to raise the standard of leadership. In today's show, I speak with Nigel Adams, who is the author of Match Fit for Transformation, Realising the Potential of Everyday Heroes. Nigel is the co-founder and director of Hetton Advisory, a boutique advisory firm specialising in building operational excellence, capability and the governance to support it. With significant experience as a passionate and innovative Chief Operating Officer, Nigel specialises in service operations management. He is known for driving performance and transformational change at pace while leading large multi-award winning teams in complex delivery networks. After 15 years in consulting, Nigel has spent the last 14 years focused on financial services operations. This has provided him with the depth and breadth of experience gained from working across a wide range of industries, challenging received wisdom and understanding industry-leading operational thinking characteristics. Nigel considers himself to be collaborative, pragmatic, resilient, adaptive and commercial, and he is confident working in complex, highly ambiguous, influence-oriented environments. Now, during the course of the conversation, we explore his book in great detail. As always, I start off by asking Nigel, why did he decide to write the book? We speak about what transformation actually is and why it's important to be match fit. We discuss individual performance metrics and understanding customer quality. And I finish the interview by asking Nigel about what operational excellence is and how do we start the journey. So keep listening. As always, we'd really like to hear your thoughts about the interview with Nigel Adams, who is the author of Match Fit for Transformation, Realising the Potential of Everyday Heroes. Happy listening.
Welcome to the Synergen Leadership Podcast with Julian Carl. Julian returns in 2019 with weekly conversations with leaders and authors from Australia and around the world, giving you the opportunity to share in their journey and learn from their expertise and knowledge. Julian also shares some of the tools and techniques he uses as a leader, mentor and facilitator, helping you to build your leadership capability and improve your confidence as a leader.
Well, welcome, Nigel, to the Synergen Leadership Podcast. Really appreciate you taking the time to actually come out to HQ and hang out with me for a little while. So the listeners have a bit of an idea of who you are. Who is Nigel Adams?
So, as you'll probably tell from my dulcet tones, originally from the People's Republic of Yorkshire in the UK, but I've been out here for 25 years and still haven't lost my accent. Very sort of strange sort of career path. I've done everything from running pubs to running cosmetic surgery centres. Spent a lot of time in consulting in different industries, from heavy manufacturing right through to sort of government. And then just in the last 15 years, spent a lot of time working with the banks, and predominantly two streams. One in payments and working capital services, trade, all the sort of transaction processing operations of banks. But at the same time, I've been there to help develop their operational capability as well.
So banking's an interesting place to not be working in at the moment?
Very much so, yep. So I left there just about sort of December last year, and obviously there's lots going on and some really challenging times for the banks at the moment.
So we're here to talk about your book, Match Fit for Transformation, Realising the Potential of Everyday Heroes. Yep. Why did you decide to write this?
There are a couple of things. One was sort of very personal, that both parents back in the UK in nursing homes, one mum had dementia for a very long time, and we always thought that as soon as she went into a nursing home, Dad would go off and do his bucket list. And then within a year of her going into a nursing home, Dad was in the same place and had gone down just as quickly. And I saw him one day, he'd no idea who I was, and I'd realised that he's not going to tick off the things on his bucket list. And so I wrote mine the following night, and one of the items on there was to write a book. Always loved books, always been surrounded by books, and it was a question of how do I get to write something which I can feel confident about writing. And so I thought, well, I'll pick something relatively close to sort of home in terms of the type of work I do. And at that time, I'd been going through a particular experience with the organisation I was working with, which was ANZ at the time. And that really just prompted me to pull this book together about the journey I went through over about a 5 to 6 year period when I was sort of working at ANZ.
Okay. Well, I'd like to start off with a bit of an excerpt, if I can. It's from chapter 1. If you work in an organisation, there's a very good chance you are being transformed as we speak. Somewhere between 80 and 90% of organisations currently have a transformation agenda. For some, this is exciting. It provides an opportunity for growth, both personal and organisational. For others, it's just the latest fad. Keeps the transformation team busy and will go away with the next round of executive change. But it fills many people with trepidation. Organisations have been transforming for years, but the scale, breadth, pace and intensity of organisational transformation, particularly digital transformation, has given a rise to a whole new level. Whatever your perspective, the transformation in your organisation will have an impact on your working life. This really resonated with me because I was doing some work earlier this week and they were launching on a full-scale transformation. So what is all this stuff about transformation?
So I think every organisation and every entity needs to evolve. And if you don't evolve, what's happening is your customers are moving forward and your competitors are moving forward. So your performance doesn't stay flat. It actually goes backwards. So you do need to change. And we see that in every aspect of our life. And organisations, it goes from very small change up to very, very large change. And one thing that's happened clearly in the last sort of 10 to 20 years is the rate of technology innovation has allowed organizations like these sort of Facebooks and Googles and the digital natives to sort of really steal a march in other areas and other industries which have almost been decimated by them. And transformation just seems to have taken on a whole new life. It's now become an existential threat for organizations. And as I say, it's not just we just need to change, we need to put a new platform in, we need to enter a new market. It's we've got to change the very fabric of what we do and how we create value because we can't keep up. That's creating this sense of threat for an organization. For people in the business, though, it's hard to recognize. Some love the idea of the change. Some love the sort of pace and the things that they're having to adapt. Others are feeling really, really nervous and are feeling very, very self-conscious about the risk to them. They've got mortgages, they've got families to look after. And this threat of, will I have a job in 2 to 3 years' time, it touches everybody and in many different ways.
I was talking to someone earlier this week and they made a really interesting observation about the way people respond to change and transformation. And their observation was that people are far more ready to do it in their personal lives than they are in their professional lives. Because they were talking about, mobile phones, everyone's using Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever on their personal life, but then professional, they don't want to touch it. So have you come across that?
I think it one of the big things for me about transformation, about how to help sort of teams through it, is you've got to understand how to connect a change that's sort of being probably initiated at the very top of the house in the organisation, and how does that become relevant for the individual? Now, within any team, you'll have the people that have been there a long time who are quite looking forward to redundancy because they can get that payout, they can get the check, they can do the big round trip around Australia. And then there's others who are at a more personal part of their career where they need the money. They've just committed to a new house, they've just committed to a new mortgage, they've got kids paying school fees or going off on doing sports training. So it's about how do you work with each individual to understand what their personal objectives are and how they can get the most out of this. And, one of the organizations I talk a lot about is about Toyota. And when they closed down their plant in Altona, the effort that the organization went into to help each individual in that plant that was going to be impacted by the change work through and how they could sort of move to the next phase of their careers and their lives was very impressive.
So you talk about this idea of being match fit.
Yep.
What is match fit? So
I guess the sport that I've spent most of my time sort of both playing and watching was rugby. And we always use, as most sporting teams do, is before the season starts, you go off on a pre-season training camp. You try and get off a little bit of the excess flab that you may have accumulated over the close season. You start to bond together. You may have a new coach. You've got sort of new players coming in, and you build that rapport. And you start just working on the basics. You're working on your just basic skills, basic rapport, basic levels of fitness, just to get ready to play. And then throughout the season, you advance that and you sort of try and refine things. The analogy for me was drawn from two areas. One, that I have a particular passion for the All Blacks, even though I'm English and B, I'm now an Australian citizen. I've been for a long time. but their approach to leadership is absolutely outstanding, notwithstanding they've just lost the World Cup. But when you think about how you tackle something like a transformation, it's about the preparation you need to do. And this book is very much around, it's not about the transformation team. It's about the 90% of the people in the organization who can actually help the transformation succeed by getting the basics right, by really sort of working together, collaborating far more effectively, and essentially laying the railroad tracks for the big steam train to come along and take us to that digital station. And so that's where the theme comes from. It's about passion for sport, what sports people go through to get really fit, and then applying it into a work context.
Okay. So you talk about this idea of setting the context.
Yeah.
So is that really about explaining the why and what we're doing and
Yep.
before we actually launch the transformation?
Yep. So there's been, obviously huge amounts of research in terms of if you want to get discretionary effort out of people, they need to have a reason why they're coming to work. It's not just for a paycheck. Yes, clearly the paycheck's important and the camaraderie with your team. But if you really want the people to go above and beyond, they need to be able to connect to the purpose of the organization. They need to be able to see how their job fits into the overall objectives of the organization. And the best example is the sort of the NASA one, and the janitor who was asked, so what's your role here, by Kennedy, and he said, my job is to put a man on the moon, because that was the mission of NASA. And even though he was the janitor, he'd connected personally to that mission. And so many organizations are realizing that now with digital, you really do need to make sure, it doesn't matter what your role is, whether you're the receptionist, whether you're the most junior person in the organization, you have to find a reason to buy into the overall mission. And that's through translation.
Mm. Do you think a lot of leaders realize the importance of that?
No, I don't. And for what, some of the coaching I've just been doing over the last couple of weeks, I go through a simple checklist with them, and there's nothing on the checklist which they don't know about. This is, it's not rocket science in many ways. But in the sort of the cut and thrust of the day, their day-to-day teams are just so overwhelmed with stuff. The obvious things just seem to get left behind. And, you come into work with all good intentions. You've got 10 items on your to-do list, and it's 5, 6 o'clock at night, and you've only got one of them done. So, but I don't think people realize just how critical it is that people really need to know why they're doing what they're doing. It doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always connect.
I'm always fascinated with all things strategy.
Yep.
So many different versions of it, so many different thoughts on it. I love it. You talk about this idea of strategy on a page.
Yep.
I wouldn't mind exploring that a little bit, because I'd like to hear your views on it.
So I think one of the real challenges for especially a large mature organization, there are so many different facets to it. And clearly communication is always seen as a critical capability. And if you want to try and bring people on the journey, you're not going to be able to encourage 10, 20, 30,000 people to read a 400-page paper on the strategy. It needs to be simple. And if you can't communicate it in threes or something as along those lines, you've got very little chance of it succeeding. So the art of a strategy on a page for me is how you can set something which covers the breadth of the organization and the breadth of its objectives in a relatively simplistic way. But it doesn't matter how good you are, when you get down to a specific individual in a specific team, the leader has got to be able to point to a sentence, a picture, a diagram, an icon on that particular strategy on a page and saying, that's what we're responsible for. The way your job helps us achieve this strategy is highlighted in this box, and to do that translation. So in simplistic terms, that idea of strategy is the Alice in Wonderland quote. If you don't know where you're going, any sort of road will get you there. But saying, where are we going? Where are we starting from? And how are we going to get there? And just to make that as simple as possible, and how to translate that into what I do on a day-to-day basis. How will that help us achieve the organization's objectives? And that for me is the beauty of a strategy on a page. So it's the document plus the translation from the leader to of how that particular document helps their people.
I think that translation points.
That's critical.
Yeah.
Because it's the language. So if you've got a team in Like I've had teams in Bangalore, I've had teams in Chengdu, I've had teams in Manila. We've got the same strategy, but culturally how they receive information, how they interact with information, you have to put it into their words and their language in a way that sort of it connects and has meaning and resonance to them, as opposed to, you know, what the CEO is trying to achieve is, you know, very big sort of strategic pictures, you know, want to simplify our business. Well, if you want to simplify your business, what does that mean for the guy that comes in and starts to do data entry today? How does that connect? And that's the job of the leader, and that is a very difficult job in many ways that often goes overlooked.
Absolutely. In chapter 3, you talk about the idea of selecting a squad.
Yep.
The people basics, and you write there's a vast difference between a champion team and a team of champions.
Yep.
So talk to me about how we select the squad.
So I'm a big believer in teams, and if you've ever been fortunate enough to work in a high performing team, it just feels different. The energy, the passion, the emotion, the connectedness, it's an extraordinary feeling. And I've been fortunate to work in a couple of teams, but for relatively short periods of time. And for me, being able to pick the team, if you become a leader and you move into and you acquire a new team, you can't just start from scratch. And it's very rare that sort of people are appointed into roles where they can start from scratch and pick exactly what they want. You have to work with people. And that's what makes leadership so fascinating, is that everybody is different. And some of the two most revered leaders I've worked with have been able to tap into the strengths of every individual. I've never hired someone where they tick every single box on the job description. But I've never hired anyone that hasn't come to the job and brought something to it that I wasn't expecting that was a real benefit. So the trick is, how do you get the people to work together? And the first thing is you've got to get the basics, the hygiene stuff out of the way. If you've got two people doing the same job and you give them different job titles, it'll just eat away at them. If two people are doing basically the same job but they've got different remuneration conditions, it will eat away at them. All that stuff, you can't have people coming into work just with that ball in their stomach thinking this is just not right, it's just not fair. So you have to deal with the basic stuff. Once you've got that, it's about, right people, right roles, and get people to play to their strengths. Don't focus on the weaknesses. No one ever told Kathy Freeman to go and practice a long jump. Focus on the strengths and look at the breadth of skills, capabilities, and competencies you need across your team, and make sure you're covering all the bases, and then how to bring the team together. That for me is it. And as the leader, I see myself as just a resource in the team. I bring certain capabilities, but I've also got many, many weaknesses, many gaps. I need other people in my team to be able to complement that. And then the last part is to build a foundation of trust. One of the great sayings I heard from a leader many years ago was, trust arrives on a tortoise, but can leave on a hare. And you will achieve, it doesn't matter how good your strategy is, it doesn't matter how ambitious your goals are, how many resources you have. If you do not have a foundation of trust with your team, you're going nowhere.
So true, couldn't agree more. On page 43, you give a people basics checklist.
Yep.
And it talks about things such as health and safety, job titles, reporting lines, remuneration, targets, all those types of things. Do you deliberately try to provide information to people in the forms of checklists and frameworks because you find that they then find it easier to implement?
Yep. Yeah. So there's a book by Atul Gawande, I think his name is, on the Checklist Manifesto, and it talks about one of the technique that has materially impacted the safety performance in both airlines and hospitals is a simple checklist. And it's such a simple tool, but we're so busy at work. We've got so much stuff on. How do I know what I need to focus on, what my priorities are? I haven't got time to wade through pages and pages of the intranet, the corporate intranet, or to go and look up many different books. Many of the advisors you see, they're domain specific. So they'll come in and they'll talk about their lean, they'll talk about metrics, they'll talk about people leadership. But I just want a simple checklist. Just tell me what I need to do. And this idea of the people basics one is, so none of the things on there would be new to a leader. However, as teams evolve over time, as they go through restructures, changes, new sort of businesses come in, bits just fall away. And you just need to make sure that those basics are all locked in. They're all tidied up. Contracts are still valid. People are being paid the right amount of money. Their grading's right. They've got the right role titles, etc. Because you don't want anything that is going to distract your people from focusing on the underlying objective. And that sense of it's not fair is one of those major distractions you've got to try and eliminate before you can actually sort of help your team get to the objectives you're trying to achieve from a business perspective.
I like your performance versus potential matrix. You talk a little to that.
This sometimes gets referred to. There's two types of matrix here. There's one there's the can do, can't do, where you've got people who do they have the technical skills or not, and do they have the right attitude? Now, I think most people have heard. It's you hire for attitude, you train for the technical. If you've got someone in your team that A, hasn't got the technical skills and B, hasn't got the right attitude, they're a ninja. You really do. You've got to get them out of your team because it's very hard to convert. But once you've gone beyond making sure you've got the right sort of people, then there are people there that who have got not only the ability to do their job today, but you can see they've got that potential to move forward in the future into more senior positions or more complex roles. There's a tendency to say we want all those high aspiring individuals in our team, but they can be quite difficult to manage because if everybody's wanting to get another job, who's going to stay home and sort of just keep the orders ticking over? Who's going to keep servicing customers on a day-to-day basis? Some of the most valuable people I've seen in teams, and sometimes they get called the rocks. The people that have been there, they're doing their job, they do a fantastic job every day. They're part of the team. They communicate well. They just enjoy what they're doing. They've got no aspirations to move up the corporate ladder, but they are so invaluable. So you have to nurture them. You have to. They are important strengths of your team. Recognize them. Don't just focus on the people that are going to be the next CEO.
Getting the scorecard right.
Yep.
I battle in our business with. I'm a big fan of scorecards, and I like the idea of making things visual But I think I've battled with, what should be on the scorecard?
Yeah.
And when I start to think about it, I once heard a story that, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but I like the idea of the story, that there was a business that existed where from the CEO down, their scorecard was literally on the wall so that everyone from wherever they are in the organisation to the CEO could see how everyone was going. And I really like that idea. But I struggle with this idea, what do we put on our scorecards? How do we determine what those metrics are?
I think that it's particularly challenging because getting the right metrics is obviously critical, and it's one of the easiest flaws is to measure what you currently report as to measure what you need to report. And sometimes getting data can be really tricky. It's easy to have too many metrics. And what happens if people have got sort of too many metrics to focus on? They focus on nothing. They just keep doing what they've been doing for the last 10 years. So really trying to discern what's critical, what's not critical. And I tend to break it down into two areas. One is I call them these operational metrics. And they're metrics that have been around for a long time and will be around for a long time in the future. And it's things like you're always going to need to know about customer satisfaction, about your quality, the service, your productivity, etc. Doesn't matter what phase you're in of your change and transformation, you will need to know those. Back when financial services were first being formed in the sort of in the Medici era, people still wanted to know were their customers happy. They still want to know what their productivity level. They would have measured those things. So you have your day-to-day operational metrics, which won't change through time. But then you have the focus on, what am I trying to change at this point in time? And they're your transformational metrics. And once again, the 2 or 3 interventions you're putting into the business to make it perform differently. And you measure that. So I have 3 or 4 metrics around the day-to-day that won't change, and 2 or 3 that will really sort of focus on what I'm looking to change that will impact those day-to-day metrics. And then as you cascade them down, some will be relevant to more junior team members and others aren't. So there's no point in giving someone a metric that they have no ability to influence. And the closer to the coalface you go, the less you need. Just give them sort of 2 or 3 things to focus on. And I would always start with quality.
You talk about the balanced scorecard.
Yep.
Are you a fan?
I am a big fan, and I've been a big fan for a long time. I'm sort of naturally quite numerically my approach. So I love the strategy map. I love the cause and effect relationships. I think that sort of that early observation that you can't just focus on the financials was critical because they're outcomes, and you've actually got to focus on the inputs and process and people capability. So I do like it. I mean, I know there are critics of it. But I still come back to that in terms of trying to get that balance right and trying to minimize that number of metrics, but still cover the bases.
It's interesting you say that about the critics, because I find that with just about every model or framework exists. You have the advocates, you have the ones that are trying to pull it apart, and then you have the ones that have never heard about it. And
I mean, you see in the book, I think I put in one of the appendix, there's probably about 150 measures I identified that are potential for a team. Now, no team is going to have if they do have 150 metrics, they're not going to be doing anything else apart from focusing on metrics. But it's horses for courses, and you have to adapt to where your business is at, the nature of the team, what it's trying to achieve, what it just needs to do on a day-to-day basis versus what it's trying to transform and what it's trying to change.
You also talk about, and I know we spoke a little bit about individual performance metrics. I'd like to dig into that a bit deeper.
Yep.
Do you think there's a reluctance by certain people to really go down the path of individual performance metrics because suddenly they're accountable?
Yes, I do. And I think this comes back to this trust issue. You talked earlier about the business that had the metrics from the CEO right down to the team member visible. Now, in some organizations, they would see as a name and shame. And that would drive so much business. It would create these undercurrents of being unease, and that's why, because you just don't have a high trust environment. I remember going and seeing the Virgin call center 15, 20 years ago now, and they had a similar sort of effect where everybody could see where everybody else was at, and there were some people who were clearly lagging, and I said, how does that guy feel? And he says, he doesn't mind, because he knows that the rest of the team will help him get to his goal, because they were team-based goals, even though it was represented as an individual on the chart. So it's the underlying cultural determined part of this. But the thing that fascinates me about individuals, and particularly individual productivity, is no one has a measure on their forehead which tells you how much capacity they have or not. And Parkinson's law applies here. So if you give someone 2 hours to do some work, they'll do it in 2 hours. If you give them 4 hours, they'll do it in 4 hours. If you give them 8 hours, they'll do it in 8 hours. So how do you know what the potential of the individual is? How can you really try to get that level of productivity from an individual to help them grow, but not to stress them out? And that's where the focus is. And I think that's one of the great arts of management and leadership of any kind. And understanding individual capacity, I think for me, is the real key to success in organizational performance, because it's so hard to do, because you've really got to tap into the emotions of the individual, the psyche of the individual, but know when they are not quite as busy as they like to say they are. I've been asking people for 15 years, how are you going today? You've got a lot on? No one has ever said, no, I've got nothing to do. Everybody is always busy. Yeah. But when you're really busy, you can just get a hell of a lot of stuff done. You've heard the old adage, if you want to get something done, give it to a busy person. Yeah.
Understanding customer quality.
Yeah.
This idea of customer focus. It's an interesting one, because there's a lot of contrary views going on about customers at the moment. Talk to me a little bit about this. I
just think it's extraordinarily difficult. The example I use a lot in my training is that there's two parts to this. One, when I first came to Australia, I had a little Ford Laser, and I remember taking it to a service station, and the guy said, look, it'll cost $150 for the service, but if there's anything wrong with it, I'll give you a call. Went to pick it up at 4:30, and car was serviced, charged me $150. Was I a satisfied customer? And when I talked to him, he said, yeah, you must have been. And I said, I was absolutely livid. I said, I arrived at 4:30, which is when they told me to arrive, but they had the radio on so loud they couldn't hear me in the workshop. There was no water in the water cooler, and it was a 42-degree day. And then I sat down on the sofa and I got oil on my suit. So whilst the outcome from that experience, the outcome from the service was good, car was serviced, it cost me $150, the experience I went through to get it was appalling. So I tried to explain that difference between the outcome and the experience. And then I said, if my mum rings into a contact centre to get an account balance, she wants to tell them that her son lives in Australia, her daughter lives in the States, all her brothers and sisters, their children live within 5 miles of where they were growing up in Leeds, and she wants to have a chat for about half an hour. At the end of that, she'll ask, can you tell me what my account balance is or whatever? If you try to cut her off any earlier, they're terribly rude at that bank of yours. When I get on the phone, I want to be off the phone within about 4 minutes flat. So how do you know whether it's Nigel or his mum calling? And because each individual defines quality in their own way, and it will be based on what your currently is going on in your life. If you've had a big night out on the terps, if you sort of had a fight with your partner, something's happening in your personal life, you will carry that into your expectations of quality in any service. I mean, I remember having a really bad day at work, coming home, and we'd been sort of charged twice on our energy bills. And I thought, right, I'm going to get on the phone. I'm going to give that, get on the phone to Origin, and I'm going to give them an absolute hammering. Not because it was particularly bad what they'd done. It wasn't great, but it wasn't really bad. But just because I was feeling that way out. And the operator for Origin was just so good, I couldn't get angry with her. So, amazing. And defining quality is really hard in a service context.
And do you think organisations are really focused on their customers?
I've got a big thing about sort of the structure of Australia, because it's such a huge country, relatively small in population terms, very, very centralised. You find lots of industries have either got oligopolies or duopolies. You don't need to be really, really good to make money in that sort of industry structure. And it's just, you look at it in the airlines. Every time you used to get another airline coming in, it would crash. You look at it in the supermarkets, look at it in financial services. It's, are we really, really that competitive? I don't think we are. Therefore, the customer is the one that tends to sort of fall by the wayside. Everybody sort of talks about being customer focused, but I don't know whether we really are. And which is why sort of a lot of the digital startups is and seeing how they're trying to tap into particular niche markets, and the take-up rate that they're getting is really interesting.
Yeah. Because I travel a lot, I have all sorts of different experiences as a customer.
Yep.
And I find it quite astounding that it just seems a lot of the interactions I have are not geared towards me as a customer.
Yeah.
They're very much geared towards whatever the organisation wants to do.
Business. Yeah. Which ultimately, you should fall by the wayside. I mean, like I said, if I go to the States, the way it's set up, if you go into like a restaurant, obviously because of the tipping situation, you expect to get great service. It drives me nuts that they're trying to over-service me because they're wanting a big tip. So, so once again, it's very, very personally defined about what you like. Yeah.
So why do you like customer journey maps?
Because I think it helps with that translation. So you have to see this from a customer perspective. And you sort of, what is a customer going through? And it starts before they even sort of enter into the organisation, into their sort of service context. But to understand what they're thinking, what are they feeling, the persona type. I mean, I guess from the old school, it'd just be the segmentation model you'd apply. But what are they thinking? What are they feeling? And then you say, what are they saying about your business? So you capture that voice of customer, you translate it into their pain points, and it's that point that is critical for me, because from that pain point, you can then define what your critical to quality measures are. That's what helps you set your processes and specification of your processes to help deliver that. Now, say the more tangible outputs, it's much easier to do in terms of how long should I take to deliver this service? What's my accuracy rate on my other quality measures? It's a bit harder on the emotional, intangible elements. But at least the people running the processes know what they are, and they can try and imagine what it's been. I've seen all sorts of examples. I've seen people with mannequins in their offices dressed up as a customer, and what people are encouraged to do in their team meetings is say, let's ask the customer. And it's just a physical representation to try and keep the customer in the business's head.
Yeah, well, isn't there that story of what Jeff Bezos does at Amazon? Is every meeting he has an empty chair. And the empty chair is supposed to represent the customer. Yeah. You also talk about the need to innovate and improve. And I find that innovation right now is probably a very, very hot topic.
Yep.
A lot of people are talking about it. But I don't necessarily think people are doing it well. I think they're sort of jumping onto the idea, but they don't necessarily create the environment or the structure behind it.
And I think it's a hot topic. Everybody wants to be seen to be part of an innovation lab. They want to be part of a startup or whatever the case may be. And initially, this section was just about, I just refer to it as improvement. But it's not as sexy a term as innovation. But for me, they are two sides of the same coin. There are very, very few breakthrough innovations. Most of them tend to be enhancements and a small step change has been a large transformative change. If you look at something like the Apollo program, that wasn't one giant leap for mankind. That was lots of continuous experiments that took place over a 13, 14-year period. Each experiment just trying out a couple of new techniques. Can we get out of the Earth's atmosphere? Can we get it back again? Can we orbit the moon? Can we land something on the moon? And so there is an element of continuation in this. And I think what it's doing is you have all these sort of tools, the resources, the new technologies, etc. And as long as you are very clear about your purpose, very clear about your customers, but the most critical question is, how do I create value? So much of what we do just doesn't add value to customers. And if we're not creating value, they're not going to give us the money. So keep people coming back to that. Why am I doing? I'm not doing change for change's sake. I'm doing change because it creates value in some way, shape, or form. And I think that starts to get over this innovation hurdle that we just, doing stuff because we think it's sexy.
Yeah, I think sometimes people think, if we put beanbags in the office and ping pong tables, they'll suddenly will innovate and we'll be all this. Yeah.
But I am a big fan of that idea of the side of the brain that's innovative is a different side of the brain that works in repeat processes. And most of us, we do like routine. We do like to work on tasks that we know how to do, so that when it comes time the need to continue to innovate is ever present. So what I've done with teams is try to blend the two. So I will blend into an operating rhythm time for us to do problem solving, to take it out of our day-to-day work. What problems are we going to fix? Where are we going to innovate? But I wouldn't just do that in the same office environment that I would have a team meeting about how we're going to get through today's work. I would try to change it up just to switch the brain, whether that will be we'd go out for a coffee. I'd go and say, right, we're going to have a theme today. And I want you to brainstorm, but everybody's got to stand on one leg and we'll stop brainstorming until someone sort of, puts both feet on the ground, just to try and change the dynamic to get people out of that routine nature of work so that they can switch on the other part of their brain.
You write about an operational excellence journey. And a couple of things which really stood out to me here was the idea of standardise and simplify. Because I think a lot of organisations are sometimes they think complexity is the answer, but I think it's actually the opposite. So what's the operational excellence journey?
So there are a couple of things to this. First and foremost, you've got to get in control of your business to start with before you can even think about your operational excellence journey. So that is the really first step, because what it means when you're in control, you've both got your quality right and you're applying the right number of resources to the problems that you deal with on a day-to-day basis. You will free up capacity. Once you've got capacity, you can then start to improve, which is a self-fulfilling cycle. Now, where lots of organizations I feel are really struggling with their transformation is they're trying to transform just fragments of processes. And because of their evolution over the last 20, 30, 40 years of acquisitions, divestments, new markets, new products, new channels, restructures, re-onshoring, re-offshoring, all of that has just created this huge, plate of spaghetti of process fragments. Now, if you suddenly then start to transform that and digitize it, and you're digitizing little strands of spaghetti, it's going to take a long time. So what the team should be focusing on is, how do I simplify? Now, lots of people talk about simplifying. We've got to simplify our business. But they don't actually say, well, what does that mean? You can take it at a strategic level, which means, we operate in fewer countries, we've got fewer channels we use, fewer markets, fewer products. Take it at a quite macro level. But when you think about how work gets done, it gets done at a process level. And what makes a process complex is how many steps there are, how many handoffs there are, how many decisions the operator needs to make, how many systems are involved, and how many variants of the process there are. You reduce any one of those combinations, and you'll have a simpler process. So this journey, the start of this journey is to say, okay, get in control. And the first thing is free up capacity by just stop doing stuff. So much of the stuff you do doesn't add value, so just stop it. That will create space. I send out this report that no one ever reads. Well, don't send it out, okay? Because you're spending an hour preparing it. Just stop doing the report. Once you've stopped doing stuff, you've got a bit of capacity. Sweep everything into a pile. Consolidate people doing the same sort of work. If you've got teams spread over different floors, bring them into one area. If you've got teams you've got a process for Victoria, a process for New South Wales, a process for Queensland, put them all together, and you'll have 3 different processes, but really it should just be one. So by sweeping them into piles and letting each other see how you do things differently, you then set yourself up to do the standardized. And this is not any color you like as long as it's black. Sensible uniformity, has to have commercial value. Don't just try and standardize everything to within an inch of its life. People still like to have a bit of creative muse around them. So just bring it together, because once you've standardized it, then you can strip out all the waste that's in there. So you've got people trying to improve and simplify one process, not 25 processes. And if you do that, then everybody gets the benefit. And then it's much easier to automate. Far, far easier to automate one than 30 processes.
So you talk about this idea, Nigel, of supporting transformational change.
Yep.
Because I imagine in organisations a lot of people aren't in the lead of it. They're there to support it. So how can they support it in a way which, suits them and at the same time suits the organisation?
So for me, this is one of the biggest challenges that organisations face when they're doing transformation. I think particularly over the last few years, senior execs and leaders, they've heard about the digital natives and what's driven their success. They've heard about all the new jobs, the data scientists, the AI specialists, the Python coders, the Scrum Masters, and they're looking through their own org charts, and we haven't got any of those. So I better go and get some. So they create a change team, a transformation team, and they hire in all these external people and who then don't know how to work in an organisation that's been around for quite a bit and don't know how to get things done. So they just get frustrated. At the same time, the 90% of people who are doing the day-to-day are thinking, right, well, I've had my budgets cut to pay for these clowns that have just come in from the change team. They're getting paid twice as much money as me. They don't know what they're doing. They haven't delivered anything. And at the end of the day, I'm going to lose my job. So you've got this tension and this real culture clash. And of course, neither's right and neither's wrong. And the trick is, how do you bring them together? How do you bring the people doing the day-to-day into the transformational tent? Because by doing that journey we just talked about in terms of the stop, standardize, consolidate, etc., you simplify the task of the transformation team. But by doing all the other things, the control and freeing up capacity, you then give the day-to-day team space to learn the new skills. So they will have a role in the future and they will learn the new skills. And so that was what I had to figure out is, how can I make that happen? And so the first thing was to make sure the two teams connect. They communicate, they're sharing information, and the people in my experience that I was working with on the change team, they were really helpful. They recognized the expertise and the knowledge I had in my area. They were willing to bring them into the tent. They were sharing showcases. They were part of working groups. They would come out to our teams to come and do demonstrations and presentations, all trying to just bind the two together so they have common goals, common metrics, common objectives, even though one's doing the big transformation stuff, the other one's just doing keeping the customers happy on a day-to-day basis. I also had to work on language because, particularly day-to-day teams can be quite blunt about the reality of, if change goes in and it's not successful, then they're usually not shy about giving feedback. But there's a way to give feedback. And by changing the language, by always making sure the customer comes into the conversation, you don't say yes but, you say yes and you're looking for positive ways, you take a can-do attitude. You're not seen to be undermining the transformation, you're seen to be supportive. So quite simple techniques in many ways, but really important to try and break down this barrier of us versus them. It's a collective we will deliver the transformation. The job of the day-to-day guys, they've got their mission to keep customers happy today, keep running, keep the quality going, preparing the railroad tracks for the transformation. The transformation teams have got to introduce all the new technologies, etc. And it's how the two work together that will deliver success.
What do the roles of the future look like?
I mean, there's a vast amount of being written about this. I think there was a really sort of concerning paper that came out about 3 years ago that, half the jobs that exist today won't exist in the future. I'm sure if we go back in time, that's been said for decades. You go back to the Luddites in sort of 1830s UK in weaving and textile manufacturing. And that's why they got sort of started to burn down factories, because they thought they were going to be out of a job. But I remember going to a roundtable session with a few CEOs that AGSM hosted many, many years ago. And there's a question that was asked about the rise of consumerism in Asia, particularly China and India, where essentially we're going to triple the number of consumers coming into the workplace, coming into the environment. How was the Earth going to cope with the lack of resources to support those consumers? And one particular CEO said, I don't know the answer, but I have enormous faith in mankind's ability to innovate and solve the problem. And so my sense about operations of the future and how people work, they will be doing different jobs. They will be doing work that's assisted by technology. Some work won't exist. Some tasks won't exist. Some jobs won't exist, but new ones will. 20 years ago, there was no such job as a blogger. No, it didn't exist. But so as the tools and the technologies move forward, new jobs come on the way. And I think for me, lots of the work that people do, particularly in like a service environment, they are routine and repetitive, and they don't particularly want to do them. It's a job and it pays the bills. They would be much rather doing more interesting work about how you can work with customers to create new value than just doing data entry or just sort of reviewing particular aspects of a system, moving data from one system to another. And that's where technology can really, really help. So I think the main thing is there's a process to get there and to equip people with the skills and techniques so they're not frightened of technology, and that they're prepared to go learn new things, be curious, be creative, try stuff out, give it a go, and look forward as opposed to bunkering down.
Mm. And I think leaders in particular, I think still a while away yet where those soft skills which leaders need to get the most out of their people, that can be taken by a robot or AI or wherever all the doomsayers are saying is going to happen.
I think, it's interesting when you look at sort of, a lot of the Harvard Business Review stuff, the McKinsey stuff, what the large consulting firms are putting out. There's two aspects. There's one, there's this huge focus on data science, coding, technology, STEM skills, blah, blah, blah. Then there's another school of thought about the soft skills. And, you absolutely, you have to have both, because ultimately people have to work together. And without that empathy, without being able to walk in someone else's shoes, understand what's motivating and driving someone, it's really hard to get anything stuff done, and especially if you're trying to build a team.
Mm-hmm. You write about this idea of establishing an operating rhythm.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about this because I imagine that would be easier for some businesses than others. So some that are based on repetition and task. Yep. And then others that are far more customer reactive would find that more of a challenge. So how can businesses start to think about their operational rhythm?
I think you're right, and that there's not a one size fits all here. There are certain businesses which lend themselves to quite an easy standardized schedule and calendar, and there are others which you have to adapt it. But every year we have a tax year, so you need to prepare your books just to make sure when do you actually when do you lock that in. Every year you want to announce what our objectives are and goals are. So when are we going to do it? Just lock it in. And an operating rhythm is really just a calendar of events. Now, sometimes the more you can put on that calendar of events, the easier it is to manage because you know when critical things are coming up. If you're in a business which is quite reactive, what you know is that as a customer inquiry comes in, that triggers a whole set of interactions. So you may not be able to plan out 9 months' time a particular customer inquiry coming in, but as soon as it comes in, you can plan out the next 3 weeks. And if you look at sort of the whole move towards agile, that was around creating an operating rhythm. It was about getting into 2 to 4 week type sprint cycles with a very, very structured rhythm of how you tackle the items on your backlog that you want to prioritize. So it's just about saying, there are things that I need to do. There are things I need to do about my people, about how I manage my people, about how I manage my finances, about how I manage my day-to-day work. What you can lay out in a calendar, do so. If you can't, if it's unpredictable, but there's a trigger, as soon as that trigger hits, put it down on your calendar and you know at least what the next few weeks are going to look like.
Okay. You actually have a section in the book towards the end called "Getting Started."
Yep.
If people want to get match fit for transformation, where should they start?
So there's two answers to the question. First of all, throughout the book, at the end of every section, at the end of every chapter, there is a checklist, and basically you work through the checklist, and if you can put a cross in the box, then that's where you start. And so it is set out sequentially, pretty much. There's also there's an appendix which talks about how to do a current state assessment, so you can check off where you're at, and that will also give you some indication of where you should start, which things are easy to do. In essence, get the context out, get the people basics done, figure out your measurements, focus on your customer quality and capacity management. In that order, then start to think about improvement and the raft of different techniques. Now, the only caveat I put on that is you do need to think about where your business is currently at. And there's a little test that I have in there called the red flag test. If when you go through the red flag test, which is 20 or 30 questions, you hit some of those red flags, you need to focus on those first. If you've got an environment where people don't feel safe, you can forget match fit for transformation. You have to solve that problem, because if people are coming to work, whether that's a physical or mental health or an emotional safety issue, you're not going to achieve anything until you address that. If there's some bullying going on in the workplace, there's some harassment, people think it's a dangerous workplace because there's there are wires that are exposed, etc. You've got to deal with those. If you've got just major systems outages just hitting you day after day after day after day, there's little bits you can sort of focus on here, but you have to have a stable operating environment to really succeed. So go through the red flag checklist, figure out if you've got any real serious pain points that need to be addressed immediately. If so, deal with them. If not, then just work through sequentially the current state assessment and the schedule that's in the last chapter.
Okay. Are there any books or particular leaders or people that inspire you in the work that you do?
Just too many to mention. I love reading. I love everything from sort of history books, sort of, the whole John le Carré sort of detective novels. I'm a big sort of believer in the classical sort of literature and stuff. A lot of the management books I've read, I've tended to go away from the more like good to great type stuff and the visionary leadership things. I like technical books that give me checklists because it just makes it easy to do my job. And then I also like things about people dynamics. So there's a great book that's been out by Robert Greene called 48 Laws of Power. Machiavelli, fantastic book to understand company politics and the Prince, how people sort of work together. So I tend to read those. Individual leaders, as I mentioned earlier, 2 leaders I've worked for who were just absolutely superb at managing individual differences. They could find the sweet spot in every person we worked for. When I was running pubs, my boss at the time, she was new into the role. She was relatively sort of young for that particular level of role. She had a very hard team, sort of a lot of dyed-in-the-wool people, been around a long, long time, weren't happy that they'd been overlooked for this particular role, wasn't a particularly well-performing team, and within a year, it was completely transformed. And that was down to her ability to manage individual differences and get the best out of each individual and get them to work together. So that was extraordinary to watch. A teacher from, I guess, grade 4, grade 5, who tutored me, from a personal perspective, he and his wife was also a teacher. When they retired, they just travel the world. They're never at home, and they were teachers, so they weren't particularly wealthy. But their passion for life, their zest for life, their ability to be curious, to try things, and they're just constantly walking around the world, experiencing new things. I love that. And then I guess the final part will be anybody that can effect significant change that has integrity, humility, dignity, and authenticity. That they're the major leader characteristics for me. This idea of, tick the box, aspirational leadership, I really don't buy into it. Just the personal agendas that drive people. No, show me authenticity anytime and I'll follow you as a leader. And I remember a coach once telling me that leadership is really simple. It's about showing people how to get from A to B and then inspiring them to follow you. So you don't forget all your thousands of dollars on management textbooks and things like that and leadership textbooks. That for me has just stuck and resonated as a thought. How do you do that inspirational part? And it's not just about the big blue sky visionary leadership. If Rome's burning, your team don't want to know where you're going to be in 5 years' time. Help them put out the fires today.
Yeah.
So you have to balance management and leadership at the same time. So.
Okay. And if people want to find out more about you and the work that you do, where should they go?
A lot of stuff I do on my LinkedIn profile, which is just Nigel Adams 1. I think I was a very early adopter of LinkedIn. No idea why that happened, but it just did. Or my website, which is Hetton Advisory, Hetton, advisory.com.
So any last words on leadership and being match fit?
Just start. It doesn't cost any money to do this. Lots of the checklists are really simple. And, the people I've been coaching over the last sort of few weeks, when they read through the quick assessments I get them to do before we start our coaching sessions, they say, I knew about that, but I just haven't had time to do it. And that's why the operating rhythm, you have to find space because you've got to get these basics in. They don't take long to do, but they really, really are important. Doesn't cost any money. There's enough checklists and matrices and toolkits in the book where you can just do it yourself. You don't have to ask for permission. You don't have to go and sort of get your boss's approval for, significant investment spend. Just get on and do it. And as I say, if you focus on quality, nothing bad will happen.
Great. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Nigel, for coming out to Synergen HQ and being on the Synergen Leadership Podcast.
Thank you very much, Julian. Really appreciate it.
Well, that wraps up episode 97 of the Synergen Leadership Podcast. Another great author episode for you. I'd like to encourage you to head on over to the Synergen Group website and engage in the conversation with us. Tell us what you liked about the episode, tell us who you'd like us to review, tell us what sort of content you'd like me to deliver to. And if you are an iPhone user, please feel free, head on over to the Apple site and do leave us a review. Really helps us build awareness of the podcast. In next week's episode, we have another great curriculum ecosystem episode for you, where I share some thoughts around a framework for identifying high performers called the 9-box grid. It's another great content episode. Till then, love to hear what you think, and as always, happy listening.